I hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving. It looks like the Syrian civil war is back on, so that's super. Look, in today's video, we're going to try to stay very high level, kind of use this as an explainer to kind of level set who these different groups are fighting in the Syrian civil war, some international backers, what they're all trying to accomplish as best as we can tell. Look, it's an incredibly complex operating environment. It is okay if you don't have a strong opinion about what's happening or any of these groups. In fact, I might argue that if you're just kind of learning about these for the first time, it's probably best to not have a strong opinion. It's just any one of these organizations, any one of these countless sides in this war comes with a lot of baggage. So just know that going in. So we are today going to show some footage from recent operations in the last couple of days, but I really want to kind of level set to where as we get further into battlefield updates and kind of situational updates in the next couple of days, weeks, and months, everybody will better understand the different organizations and locations that we're talking about. So what we know right now is that a wide array of opposition groups have been fighting back against the Russian and Iranian-backed Assad regime in Syria. So starting out pretty high level here, you've got opposition groups and or rebel groups. Some people get upset if you call them rebels, but it's the non-governmental forces inside of Syria fighting back against the Assad regime. Bashar al-Assad leads Syria. He is largely backed, heavily backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, actually, as well. We'll get into all of those relationships here briefly. In fact, there's some, these forces are actually suffering losses in this most recent offensive. Haven't heard anything about Hezbollah, but we've got at least one Iranian IRGC official that was a general that was killed, and it looks like some Russian special operations forces may have been eliminated as well. So what we know right now, and showing some of the footage coming out of the battlefield, is that just since this battle began a couple days ago, it sounds like rebel forces or opposition forces have captured 20 regime soldiers and 2 members of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. Rebel forces are calling on regime personnel to defect while they still have the chance, which is interesting when you think about it. You've got the non-governmental forces, the insurgents in a sense, dropping leaflets, and we've seen some of these leaflets over government positions saying, hey, give up, walk away. It's okay. We won't hurt you. Usually that's the other way around, so I felt like that was worth bringing up. Now, it's been reported that opposition forces have seized the Syrian Army's 46th Regiment base and at least 8 villages in that area. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that 121 rebels, most of them members of HTS, and we're going to get into that group here in a second, and 40 government groups and 21 militiamen had been killed over the past 2 days. The rebels said in a telegram statement that they had killed more than 200 members of the pro-Assad government forces. A Syrian military statement put out on Thursday said that its forces had, quote, confronted the terrorist attack that is still ongoing with various weapons and in cooperation with friendly forces, leaving heavy losses in equipment and casualties among terrorists, end quote. The Syrian government did not say anything about losses within their forces, but Iranian news agencies said that a senior commander in the IRGC serving as a military advisor, Brigadier General Pour Hashemi, we'll go with that, probably butchered that one, was killed in Aleppo province. And then Turkey, another international actor very heavily involved in the Syrian civil war, their state-run media said, apparently reporting from Idlib province, that the Syrian opposition had taken control of 400 square kilometers in Aleppo and Idlib province, reaching 1 kilometer outside of Aleppo city. And that's going to be important here in a second. Now, we do know that, haven't heard much from Iran other than the fact that some of their senior leaders in Syria have been killed. Russia has begun to assist the Assad regime. Russian airstrikes kicked off shortly after this operation began, striking targets in southern Idlib. They say that despite the rebels' intense advances in western Syria, Russia has focused on targeting eastern Syria under the pretext of fighting against the Islamic State, rather than supporting the Assad regime on the western front lines. That's notable because what you'll find, and we'll probably see a lot of this in the coming days, anybody that Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia fight in Syria, they label as terrorists, they label as Islamic State, and they label as Al-Qaeda. Because those are easy ones to get behind, right? There's not really anyone in the world that looks at ISIS and says that's good. So when any of these groups say we're out there killing ISIS, it generally gets most people on board. However, there's been a lot of evidence, to include just what happened today, that a lot of these groups are targeting relatively moderate Syrian opposition forces and just calling them Islamic State. So just keep in mind when you hear something from Russia, Iran, or Hezbollah, they are going to refer to everyone that they are fighting. Every force pushing back against Assad, to them, is Islamic State. It's part of the messaging war there. Now, there's also been some speculation that a group of Russian special operations forces may have been included in the groups that were killed or captured so far by the Syrian opposition forces. It's not entirely. I think I saw one video that may have been a captured Russian soldier, an FPV pilot. But just based off of some of the equipment that we're seeing pulled out by the opposition forces, it's stuff only utilized by Russian special operators who are there in Syria. That's not like a secret or under the radar or anything. They are there assisting Assad. So we'll wait for more information on that front. Now, digging into why Aleppo, where the focus of this fighting has been, and why now. It's kind of intertwined. So Aleppo is the second largest governorate in Syria and is pretty strategically important in a couple different ways. It's an intersection of the M4 and M5 highways, two of the most important transport hubs across the entire country of Syria. And one of the aims of the rebel offensive that they outlined on Thursday was to try to take back some of the areas that was cleansed of over 1 million civilians by the Assad regime forces under the cover of Russian airstrikes in 2019 to 2020 to facilitate their return. So this is a contested area. There was a ceasefire brokered here a couple of years back. The opposition forces have argued that Syria, backed by Russia, violated this ceasefire over and over again and continued pushing into opposition-controlled territory. That is the area they began this fighting over a couple days ago. However, they advanced so rapidly that they haven't stopped, and they're just kind of continuing on. So why now is a good, valid question. We've got a statement here from Nick Harris, an analyst with the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. He said the rebels were, quote, trying to preempt the possibility of a Syrian military campaign in the region of Aleppo, which Russian and Syrian government airstrikes against rebel areas have been preparing for. So that's one of the arguments, that they were just preempting this offensive that was in the works. That's possible. However, we also have to look at some broader timing here as well. It's worth noting that this opposition offensive kicked off the exact same day that the Lebanon-Israel truce came into effect. Now, given the size of what we're seeing play out in Syria right now, it's clear that this has been planned for quite a while, but we can't divest it entirely from the general timing. So opposition forces here may have been banking on the fact that this is a window in time where Russia is relatively occupied in Ukraine, and more on that here briefly, or in a moment. Iran is very occupied with the ongoing war with Israel, and more on that in a moment. And Hezbollah, a group that has regularly sent reinforcements in, that served as a major ground component for the Assad forces, probably isn't going to be able to do that anytime soon based off of their recent ceasefire with Israel that just went into effect. I mean, Hezbollah took a lot of losses in the last couple months. So it's possible the opposition forces saw this as a possible window to try to take advantage of a weakness in the Assad regime. Now, I think it's worth diving into HTS. This is the group that is kind of leading the charge right now in terms of this offensive. This stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And you're going to hear this group referred to as Al-Qaeda linked or Al-Qaeda affiliated. And look, it's messy. So what we know right now, HTS is estimated to be around 10 to 15,000 strong in terms of personnel in their organization. They came out of Jabhat al-Nusra. All right, so we need to back up here a little bit. Jabhat al-Nusra was created back, and I want to say 2010, 2011, and it was designed as the Al-Qaeda affiliate for Syria. All right, so it was a direct Al-Qaeda organization, just without the official Al-Qaeda name. But there was a close relationship there between Al-Qaeda Central and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Islamic State came about, kind of took power and took over a lot of territory in Syria and Iraq, and Baghdadi went to Jabhat al-Nusra and said, you're now going to be a part of us. And they said, no. And Zawahiri, in charge of Al-Qaeda at the time, said, no, that's not okay. And there was actually a point where Jabhat al-Nusra was fighting and killing, or it was engaged in direct combat with Islamic State fighters. So when you hear anybody say that HTS is Islamic State, no, they've actually fought against Islamic State in the past and never formally became a part of that organization. So they continued on as Al-Qaeda, as an Al-Qaeda affiliate, but then in 2017, actually, the United States had been carrying out airstrikes against Jabhat al-Nusra. We were actively fighting, of course, a Al-Qaeda affiliate. But then I want to say it was 2017, Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded to HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and at that time publicly disavowed Al-Qaeda and said we were no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda. That actually caused some rifts. Zawahiri at the time pushed back and said it wasn't good for the overall movement. But again, the public statements from HTS were, we are no longer a part of Al-Qaeda, and they've never been a part of Islamic State. Now, they are a Salafi jihadi organization, so they're, in a lot of ways, you could say it's Al-Qaeda light. They hold a lot of similar ideology. There's some arguments that they are more nationalist in focus than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, of course, much more of a global entity. And there's some debate that HTS might be more moderate. But they're, at the very least, in the same vein as Al-Qaeda. So remember when I said it's messy? This is just a little tidbit of that. Now, HTS is designated a terrorist organization by the United States, the United Kingdom, European Union, Canada, Turkey, and Morocco. They're also actively fighting against Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, and Assad. Just a little teaser as to how messy and complicated this is going to get. In fact, I think it's worth bringing up a couple maps. You're going to see a lot of map updates, I think, in the coming days. Be very careful with those. I don't think they're all that important. I mean, when we look at the very localized gains around Aleppo, that'll give us an idea. But some of these older maps, you'll see some of these, and it's tempting to want to use these because we look at the war in Ukraine, you can see a clear differentiation in the lines. Ukraine is on this side, Russia is on this side, and that's where the fighting is taking place. It is so messy in Syria. You look at some of these maps, and at times it's broken down into very large factions. But what that's missing is that some of these areas that are controlled by, say, the SDF or the Free Syrian Army or even Assad forces, there's so many different factions within that at times are fighting against one another. So I did come across a really good map a couple days ago that I can't find now. It wasn't accurate for what it's worth, but it was like instead of 3 or 4 different colors, it was like 73 different shades of colors. And I thought that was just perfect to show how incredibly complex the, quote, front lines are in this conflict. If I find it, I'll share it over on X. So diving into a couple of the different sides here to, again, kind of set the stage for the groups we're looking at. On the one side, we have the Bashar al-Assad, pro-Assad forces that we've talked about a little bit, and we're going to get more into kind of their international backing here in a minute. But I want to first start with diving into the resistance forces, the opposition forces, the rebel forces. Again, there's kind of some landmines in there with how you talk about this. So starting out, they're kind of in 3 different groups. You've got the Islamist groups, the Kurdish-led groups, and then the more moderate generalist opposition groups that just don't like Assad, right? So starting with the Islamist groups, we already talked about HTS, formerly aligned with Al-Qaeda, although probably still has some. One of the U.S. arguments against HTS is that they maintain covert ties with Al-Qaeda. However, HTS has arrested and detained Al-Qaeda operatives in recent years, so it's not entirely clear, but either way, officially, HTS still a designated terrorist organization. Other factions such as Haras al-Din remain loyal to Al-Qaeda, and they actually oppose and at times fight against HTS. And then there are still some Islamic State factions kind of operating in eastern Syria. Not a lot. Significantly degraded from where they were just a couple years ago, but they are still there in certain portions of the country. So then we've got the Kurdish-led forces. The primary one here really is the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. This is dominated, kind of the large part of this is by the Kurdish YPG, or People's Protection Unit. And this is largely in and around northeastern Syria. And there's some maps that help show this pretty well. Now, the SDF has kind of been the main U.S. ally in the fight in Syria against Islamic State. But its ties to the PKK have made this quite a bit more complicated. So PKK is a Kurdish separatist movement and a recognized terrorist organization in Turkey, which kind of means that the SDF, in turn, has become a target of Turkish military operations. So they're fighting against, and one of the reasons this gets so complicated, I hate to keep using that word, but SDF is fighting against the Assad-backed regime forces, but also against the Islamist forces. And then since those two groups that they're fighting are actively fighting each other, sometimes you end up with these kind of uncomfortable relationships, temporary friendships, to kind of take the fight to a common enemy. Now, in terms of the size of the organization, SDF's most recent estimate is around 100,000 fighters. And then last one here, we've got this moderate opposition. It started out as the Free Syrian Army, which was at one point just kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different rebel groups that's largely fragmented over the years. A big portion of that now falls under the Syrian National Army, which is a Turkish-backed coalition operating mostly in northern Syria. But the SNA is arguably more focused right now on fighting the SDF than they are pro-Assad forces. So remember that uncomfortable SDF-PKK relationship? So Turkey doesn't like that, and at times kind of views them as one and the same. So they've helped organize and equip and train the SNA as sort of a Syrian proxy to deter and degrade the SDF/PKK. Holy cow, acronyms. All right, so when looking at the size of the SNA, you're talking about 80 to 100,000 fighters in total. That's the most recent estimate. All right, now diving into the pro-Assad forces here, and I think it's really important at this point to dive into some of the international backers, starting with Iran. So Iran's really been a cornerstone when it comes to support of the Assad regime, providing military, economic, and logistical aid since the early days of the Syrian civil war. Iran's focus in Syria has largely been projecting power in the region, countering U.S. and Israeli interests, and then ensuring some sort of strategic foothold. Iranian-backed militias, including those that fall directly under the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, remain pretty active all across Syria and Iraq, which is important here. Think of these militia groups as kind of helping to maintain a land corridor from Tehran in Iran through Iraq all the way into Beirut in Lebanon, which helps to facilitate arms shipments directly from Iran to Lebanese Hezbollah. All right, and right now, of course, Iran, in this case, little preoccupied with their ongoing war with Israel. Right, they've got some of their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah most notably, that are significantly degraded over the course of the last year, and Hezbollah in the process of, well, we'll see if this ceasefire actually holds. And Iran, of course, been on the receiving end of Israeli direct military action. So there's a lot of arguments right now that Assad might have to take a back seat to Iran having to deal with and figure out how to survive in the face of mounting Israeli strikes against their own interests. Now, shifting over to the Russian involvement, another group that just happens to be preoccupied at the time. So Russia's been involved since the Syrian civil war began back in 2011. However, the past few years, Russia has been a little more focused on this, war in Ukraine, which has pulled resources and personnel from the Syrian theater. So Russian conventional forces and private military companies like the Wagner Group were pretty instrumental in helping Assad hold back opposition forces early in the war and eventually to recapture some of their lost territory. Russia's played a big role this entire time, to include the ongoing use, like we've just seen in the last couple of days, of providing air support for pro-Assad forces. Now, Russia really has two goals in Syria. One is ensuring their man Assad stays in power, who actually, just like yesterday, took off from Syria to Russia. Surprise visit. Can't imagine what they're going to talk about. And the second is maintaining access to the Tartus naval base, which is Russia's only Mediterranean port. Now, I should note that on Russian Telegram channels right now, they're blaming a lot of this opposition success of the past few days on the fact that bad Russian generals, like poor performers, are the ones being sent to Syria, whereas the good ones either remain in Ukraine or are pulled from Syria into Ukraine. So take that for what it's worth. Either way, don't expect any significant Russian reinforcements to come to Assad's help here anytime soon. Now, turning over to Hezbollah, which I feel like is kind of under the radar, but for quite a while, Hezbollah has served as a very significant ground force component for the Assad regime. Now, a big part of this is them viewing Assad as a regional ally of sort, a part of this Iranian-led axis of resistance, but also Hezbollah's source of military power comes directly from Iran through Syria. So if Assad falls, Hezbollah is essentially cut off from their main backer. So they need those smuggling routes from Syria into Lebanon to stay open. Of course, Hezbollah just got hammered pretty good by Israel and agreed to a ceasefire deal. I mean, we're talking hundreds, maybe thousands of Hezbollah fighters taken off the battlefield just in the last few weeks. And any Hezbollah fighters that the Assad regime may have been banking on to kind of step in as reinforcements are unlikely to arrive anytime soon. And remember, and something we just talked about in a recent video, Israel has made it pretty clear in recent days that they're closely monitoring the border crossings from Lebanon into Syria. So that pipeline, whether it's moving weapons from Syria into Lebanon, which is what Israel says they're watching it for, or moving weapons and fighters from Lebanon into Syria, which is what Assad might be in need of right now, as Aleppo faces down this opposition offensive, that movement is going to be pretty significantly hampered, if not shut down entirely, for quite a while now, with increased Israeli focus on those border crossings. Now, turning to the U.S. involvement, which as it relates to the current offensive we're seeing play out right now, not all that important. The U.S. has primarily been focused in the eastern portion of Syria, and if we look at a map here, the areas where the U.S. has a presence is very different from where the actual fighting is taking place. So by and large, HTS is going up against, you got to think of Syria as split a little bit with their international backers. Right now, HTS is going up against Iranian, Russian, and Hezbollah-backed forces. All right, they're not coming up against any U.S.-backed forces in that part of the country, and HTS is not U.S.-backed. So the U.S. involvement kind of originated back in 2014 with a troop deployment to Syria to combat Islamic State. U.S. efforts there have kind of shifted over the years into supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces, who in a lot of ways kind of provided the bulk of the ground forces in that ongoing fight against ISIS. Today, fewer than 1,000 troops remain in northeastern Syria. There's a couple different bases there. They're primarily focused on counterterrorism operations, then stabilizing some of those areas that have been liberated from Islamic State. And lastly, a big player here in the Syrian civil war is Turkey. I feel like it doesn't get enough attention here in the United States. So over the past year, Turkey has maintained control over pretty large swaths of territory in northern Syria through military operations like Euphrates Shield, Olive Branch, and Peace Spring. Those zones inside of Syria are all now governed by Turkish-backed Syrian militias. So Turkey's main focus when looking at Syria is really the Syrian Democratic Forces. Remember, we mentioned it a minute ago, they kind of refer to them as one and the same, or at least very closely aligned with the PKK, who Turkey views as a terrorist organization. So Turkey's role in Syria as it sits today is kind of a blend of military, political, and economic goals and incentives. Again, we're talking about a hot war right on their border, so clearly Turkey has a lot of interest at play and a lot of interest in how this war actually shakes out. All right, that's it. I feel like we just barely scratched the surface, but that might actually be good. I didn't think it would be valuable to dive back into past offensive operations and the history of the war because it's so complicated today that the further you go back, the more complicated it becomes. So we'll see. Nice surface level overview, and we'll get more information in the coming days, an update on the opposition advances or if they've been stopped. And hopefully with this video in your back pocket, we're all a little better suited to understand what's actually playing out on the ground. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.